You send a message. Nothing important, just a simple text, a question, or a joke, or just a thought you wanted to share. A few minutes pass, then an hour. And somewhere during that time, you start checking your phone. Not once, multiple times. You open the conversation, close it, open it again, as if the reply is going to appear the moment you look at it. You check whether they've been online. They have. So you check again 15 minutes later. They've been online again. And now something has shifted, because a few minutes ago the silence felt neutral. Now it feels a little weird. A signal, a clue, a message hidden inside the absence of a message. And that raises an uncomfortable question. When exactly did silence stop being silence? Because there was a time, not so long ago, when this feeling didn't exist. You called someone. Nobody answered. You assumed they were somewhere else, doing something else, living their life. The silence wasn't personal. It wasn't a message. It was just silence. Now it has changed. A friend doesn't reply for 3 hours. You notice. A partner takes longer than usual. You notice. Someone views your story, doesn't respond to your message. You definitely notice. A colleague doesn't reply to an email you sent this morning. It's now late afternoon, and you've already started wondering. It's not the silence that changed, but your relationship with silence changed. And that's what this is really about. Think about what actually happens inside your mind during those hours of waiting. First, you assume they're busy. That's the reasonable explanation. That's the one you hold on to. Then, slowly, your mind starts moving toward the second explanation. Maybe they saw it and decided not to reply yet. Then the third. Maybe something you said didn't land right. Then the one you don't want to think about. And here's what's strange. None of that information actually exists. The only thing that exists is silence. Yet, by this point, your emotions have already responded to events that actually didn't happen, to a conversation that hasn't taken place, to a conclusion that nobody has reached. You feel anxious, or frustrated, or suddenly unsure of something you felt fine about this morning. All of it created by the absence of words, not by words themselves. Think about how specific this gets in daily life. You send a message to a friend you haven't spoken to in a few weeks. You had a good conversation last time. Everything felt normal. Everything felt easy. They don't reply for 2 days. And now you're sitting with a quiet but persistent question. Did something change? Not because anything happened. Not because they said anything. Not because there's any evidence of a problem. Just because the silence arrived where a reply was expected. Or think about the workplace. You send an email to a colleague, something routine, something that doesn't require urgency. By end of day, nothing. And without deciding to, you've already started wondering whether it was received correctly, whether the tone came across as intended, whether something in the wording landed differently than you meant. The email was fine. The relationship is fine. They were probably in meetings all afternoon. But the silence created a space, and your mind filled it before reason had the chance to arrive. This happens in romantic relationships more than anywhere else. Your partner is quieter than usual at dinner. Nothing happened earlier. No argument, no difficult conversation. They just seem elsewhere. And immediately, the mind begins working. Are they tired? Are they upset about something? Did I do something? Did I not do something? Is something wrong between us? Is this the beginning of a distance? All of that from a quiet dinner, from the simple absence of the usual conversation. And the uncomfortable truth is that the person across the table might just be tired, might just have had a long day, might just be somewhere in their own thoughts, not about you, not about the relationship, not about anything alarming. Just present, but quiet. Human beings are allowed to be quiet. But somewhere along the way, in a world that made communication constant and visible and expected, quiet started needing a reason. To understand why this happened, you have to go further back than you might expect. Imagine sending a letter 200 years ago. You write it carefully, you seal it, you send it, and then you wait. Days pass, sometimes weeks, sometimes months. Nobody interpreted that silence as a hidden message. Nobody spent those weeks wondering if the recipient was upset, because silence was expected. Silence was simply the time it took for the letter to travel. It had no meaning beyond distance. Now imagine sending a message today. It arrives in less than a second. You know it arrived. They know you know it arrived. The little tick confirms delivery. The second tick confirms it reached their phone. The blue tick, if they turn it on, confirms they've read it. Every single step of that journey is now visible. And the moment a journey becomes visible, every pause along the way becomes noticeable. Think about that shift for a moment. When information is invisible, absence means nothing. When information is visible, absence means something changed. That's the entire story. That's why the same silence that once felt ordinary now feels loaded. Not because people changed, because the system changed. And the human mind, without anyone asking it to, adapted. It's a bit like electricity. Walk into your house and discover there's no power. You notice immediately. Not because electricity became more important today, because you're used to having it. The same thing happens with communication. Once immediate access became normal, delays started feeling like interruptions. Once constant availability became expected, unavailability started requiring explanation. And that's where the discomfort lives. Not in the silence, in the gap between what you've learned to expect and what you're actually receiving. Now here's the part most people don't talk about. Silence doesn't just leave a space. It leaves a space that the mind immediately begins to fill. Think about the last time someone said, "We need to talk," then went quiet for several hours. You didn't calmly wait for more information. Your mind produced possibilities, dozens of them, some reasonable, some completely unlikely, all of them vivid, all of them feeling real. That's not a flaw. That's the mind doing exactly what it was designed to do. The human brain was built to predict. When you cross a road, you don't wait for a car to hit you before you move out of the way. You predict it might come, and you act on that prediction. The same system applies to silence. The brain reads the available information, detects uncertainty, and immediately begins building scenarios to protect you from whatever might be coming. The problem is that the scenarios often arrive before the facts, and emotions don't know the difference. So the brain produces a story, and the emotions respond to the story. A delayed reply doesn't actually contain rejection. A delayed reply contains uncertainty. The rejection is something we add ourselves. The distance we sense, the coldness we detect, the shift we're convinced happened. Often created by silence and finished by imagination. And here's what makes this especially strange. Two people can receive the exact same delayed reply. Same conversation, same message, same amount of time passed. One shrugs and moves on. The other spends the afternoon replaying what they wrote, wondering what they did wrong. Same silence, completely different experience. Why? Because silence doesn't arrive alone. It arrives carrying whatever was already waiting beneath the surface. If someone fears rejection, silence sounds like rejection. If someone fears being forgotten, silence sounds like forgetting. If someone worries they're too much, silence sounds like confirmation. The silence didn't put those fears there. It just gave them room to speak. That's why the experience feels so personal, because it is personal. Not because the other person made it that way, but because the silence walked through a door that was already open. And modern technology made sure that door stays open more often. Read receipts, typing indicators, last seen timestamps, online status updates, story views, delivery notifications. Each one a tiny piece of information, each one creating a slightly bigger invitation for the mind to interpret what's happening. You see someone was online 10 minutes ago, didn't reply. You notice. You see the typing indicator appear, then disappear without a message. Now the silence isn't just silence. It's a silence that started to speak and then stopped. That's a completely different experience. That's uncertainty with evidence attached to it. And evidence, even tiny evidence, gives the mind something to work with. You didn't have this problem with letters. You didn't have it with landlines. You had no way of knowing whether someone was near their phone, sitting at their desk, or actively choosing not to respond. Now you can know. And sometimes knowing a little is more unsettling than knowing nothing at all. Every time communication became faster, the acceptable window of silence became smaller. Letters, weeks were acceptable. Phone calls, hours were acceptable. Emails, a day was acceptable. Texts, an hour started feeling long. Instant messages, 30 minutes raises an eyebrow. Seen on social media, 20 minutes and you're already wondering. The window keeps closing, and as the window closes, the silence inside it gets heavier. Nobody designed it this way. No technology company sat down and said, "Let's make silence feel threatening." It happened gradually, quietly, in the same way most things change when you're not paying attention. Each new platform moved the expectation slightly. Each new feature made information slightly more visible. Each small shift trained the mind to expect slightly more and tolerate slightly less. Until one day, 3 hours of silence from someone you care about feels like a long time, and you can't quite remember when it started feeling that way. So let's answer the question this video started with. Why does silence feel suspicious now? The answer has 3 parts. The first part is expectation. When immediate communication becomes normal, anything slower than immediate becomes noticeable. The silence isn't heavier, your expectations are higher. The second part is visibility. Technology gave us the ability to see whether someone is online, whether they read our message, whether they started typing. That visibility removed the comfortable unknowing that once made silence easy to accept. When you couldn't see any of it, you assumed they were busy. Now you can see them. Now the silence requires a different explanation. The third part is the mind's need for closure. Human beings are deeply uncomfortable with unfinished things, unanswered questions, incomplete stories, open loops. Silence creates all 3 simultaneously, and the mind, doing exactly what it was built to do, tries to close those loops. With theories, with assumptions, with stories that feel real before anyone has had the chance to speak. Put those 3 things together: raised expectations, increased visibility, and a mind that cannot leave things unfinished, and you get a world where silence is no longer neutral, where a few minutes of quiet can feel like something is wrong, where an unanswered message can briefly feel like a verdict, where a quiet room with a phone face down on the table isn't quite as peaceful as it used to be. Here's what's important to understand. This is not weakness. This is not overthinking. This is not a personality flaw. This is a normal human mind navigating a world it wasn't designed for. Because evolution didn't prepare us for read receipts. It prepared us to pay close attention to social signals, to notice when something in our environment shifted, to respond to uncertainty with increased alertness. That system served human beings well for hundreds of thousands of years. It still works perfectly. It just now fires every time a message goes unread for longer than expected. The hardware is the same. The world it's running in changed completely. And here's what changes once you understand this. You stop blaming yourself for the feeling. Because the feeling isn't irrational. It's an ancient, well-designed system responding to modern inputs it wasn't built for. You also start seeing silence differently. Most of the time, a delayed reply is exactly what it appears to be: a person who is busy, distracted, living their life, not near their phone, not thinking about the conversation in the way you are, not because they don't care, because they're human. And humans were never supposed to be constantly available. A delayed reply can reveal a lot about another person, but it often reveals more about the person waiting. Because the moment certainty disappears, something else becomes visible. Your fears, your expectations, your need for reassurance, your need to feel that you matter. The silence didn't create those needs. It illuminated them. And perhaps that's the strangest part. Perhaps that's why silence feels so powerful. Not because it's full of answers, but because it exposes the questions you were already carrying. Questions about connection, questions about belonging, questions about where you stand. The silence simply gives those questions room to speak. And once you understand that, the experience begins to shift. A delayed reply becomes a delayed reply, not evidence, not proof, not a verdict. An unread message becomes an unread message, not a statement, not a signal, not a judgment. A quiet room becomes a quiet room, not a warning, just space. The kind of space that silence used to be, before the world became fast enough to make it feel like something else. Because here's the thing about silence that often gets forgotten. Silence was never supposed to provide answers. Silence was supposed to be the space before answers arrive. The breath before the sentence. The pause before the reply. The gap between one moment and the next. Not a message, just time. Somewhere along the way, quietly, without anyone planning it, we started treating that space as if it were speaking. We started listening to silence as though it contained meaning. And in doing so, we often stopped noticing whose voice we were actually hearing. Because the moment silence arrives, the loudest voice in the room is usually not theirs. It's your own. Carrying questions you had before the silence came, fears that existed before the message went unanswered, needs that were there long before the conversation even started. Silence didn't become suspicious. We became more aware of what was already there. And maybe, just maybe, that awareness is worth something. Not because it makes the waiting easier, but because it shows you something true about what you're hoping for, about what you're afraid of, about how much you care about the people you're waiting on. And caring, even when it's uncomfortable, is not the problem. It never was.